The silence in her apartment was louder than the university protest happening 2 blocks away. It was a suffocating quiet, meticulously maintained by the man who occupied the other end of the overlong, pristine sofa. A man who was her husband in name, but a complete stranger in every chamber of her heart. Seraphina always remembered the city of Port Meridian in 2 distinct shades: the grey, restrictive concrete of her father's influence, and the bright, salt-washed blue of the bay, which she rarely saw. Port Meridian was a thriving coastal centre, a medium-sized metropolis known for its historic university district, where Seraphina studied literature, and its brisk financial sector, where her father, Mr. Alistair Vance, dominated. Alistair was not merely strict. He was a monument of expectation, a man whose love was conditional upon obedience, whose voice was a low, resonant pronouncement of law. Seraphina, thin as a reed and accustomed to folding herself into the smallest possible space, moved through the world like a ghost, her huge dark eyes the only part of her that betrayed a vibrant, desperate inner life. At 18, still raw from the sudden loss of her gentle, quiet mother, Seraphina was given to Adrian Thorne. Adrian was a young man from a respectable family, eager, polite to a fault, and hopelessly, sincerely in love with the idea of marrying an Alistair Vance. He saw Seraphina not as the terrified, brilliant mind she was, but as a delicate trophy, a reward for his good behavior in the world. "He is dependable, Seraphina. He is order," her father had declared, slamming a ledger on the mahogany desk. "You require order." And so, the wedding happened, a grand, sterile affair in the spring, just as the jacaranda trees along the university avenues were bursting into purple flame. She moved from one cage, her father's house, to another, Adrian's perfectly organized, sterile apartment near the Port Meridian harbour, a place where the scent of cleaning supplies always overshadowed the sea air. The first night had set the tone for the next 3 years. Adrian, nervous, perhaps overwhelmed by the gravity of possession, was clumsy. He was all fumbling hands and well-meaning pressure. Seraphina, already recoiling from the forced proximity and the emotional breach of privacy, froze. She became a statue, and Adrian, interpreting her stillness as the fragility he had been warned about by her father, retreated in a haze of apology and embarrassment. "It's all right, Seraphina, we have time. I respect you too much to rush," he'd whispered, pulling a blanket over her and turning his back. That apology was the key to her prison. Adrian's respect became a wall. He loved her, yes, but he loved the image of her, the shy, silent wife, more than the woman inside. He never pushed, never probed the depths of her silence, never understood that his respect was actually neglect. Their marriage was a shared apartment, a dual signature on bank documents, and a terrifying, untouched distance. 3 years passed in this silent, chaotic non-relationship. The marriage was never consummated. She remained a virgin, locked in a permanent state of suspended disbelief. Seraphina buried herself in her studies at Midtown University. The sprawling campus with its humid, ink-scented libraries and the echoing lecture halls became her true home. She loved the city's lifeblood, the smell of espresso from the pavement cafes, the sound of the trams clattering past the old brick faculty buildings, the rush of students talking about philosophy, art, and freedom. She was an observer of this life, never a participant. It was during her final semester, while researching a paper on the Romantic poets, that the routine fractured. The third-floor library annex at Midtown was her sanctuary. It smelled of old paper and dust motes, dancing in the afternoon sun that streamed through the arched windows. She was curled into a worn leather armchair, attempting to reconcile her required reading on the subjugation of female characters with her own painfully subjugated reality. He was sitting at the massive oak table opposite her, marking papers. He was older, perhaps 28 or 29, not a professor but a research fellow in the history department, Liam Kalin. She had seen him often, a man with the quiet confidence of someone who had truly found his place in the world. He had rugged, kind features, a shock of dark, unruly hair, and eyes the color of old whiskey that seemed to hold a vast, unreadable peace. He glanced up once, catching her gaze, and instead of the sudden, shy withdrawal she usually inflicted and expected, she held it. There was no possessiveness in his look, no judgment, just a gentle, inquiring curiosity, a spark of connection, as clean and immediate as a struck match. Seraphina's hand trembled slightly as she tried to return to her book. The next day she found a small, neatly folded note tucked into the pages of her textbook. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was a married woman. The weight of Adrian's misplaced trust and her father's phantom disapproval crushed her. She unfolded the paper. In clean, decisive handwriting it read, "The quietest people often have the loudest minds. What are you reading that requires such intensity?" L. It was simple, direct, and saw past the thin frame to the mind within. She felt a heat rise in her cheeks, but also a thrilling, terrifying sense of being seen. She wrote a response on a torn corner of her own notebook paper. Subjugation, and finding a way out of the metaphor. E. The exchange became their secret ritual. Over the next 3 weeks, notes flew across the oak table, transforming from intellectual sparring partners to tentative friends. He learned about her love for early Irish poetry. She learned about his work on urban history and his easy, infectious laughter. One rain-swept afternoon, they were the only two left in the annex. Liam looked up from his work, pushed a stray lock of hair off his forehead, and simply said, "The library closes in 10 minutes. I'm walking to the Bay Street Cafe. You should join me." It was not a question or a demand. It was an invitation to freedom. Seraphina's immediate, frantic thought was of Adrian. Adrian, who would be waiting at home, expecting her to review the dinner menu he'd prepared. But the idea of returning to that mausoleum of a marriage suddenly felt unbearable. "Yes," she heard herself say, the word dry and scratchy in her throat. Outside, the rain had turned the granite streets of Port Meridian into polished glass. The city lights smeared and stretched, beautiful and blurred. They walked under Liam's heavy canvas umbrella, hip to hip. The accidental, gentle press of his side against hers was a shock, a warmth she hadn't realized she was starved for. At the cafe, surrounded by the lively clatter of conversation and the rich scent of dark roast coffee, Seraphina finally spoke about the truth of her life. She didn't mention the unconsummated marriage, but she spoke of the rigid expectations, her father's iron grip, and Adrian's gentle, well-intentioned indifference. Liam listened, his gaze steady, his attention absolute. He never interrupted, only offered a slow nod now and then, recognizing the weight of her words. "It sounds," Liam finally said, stirring his coffee slowly, "like you've been asked to live in the margins of your own story. And that's a tragedy for a mind like yours, Seraphina." The simple validation was an action more potent than any physical move. It was the moment the emotional dam, built by years of repression, began to crack. Their meetings became more frequent, always discreetly around the university or in the neutral public bustle of the city centre. She felt a lightness around Liam she hadn't experienced since childhood. She laughed, a real, sound-out-loud laugh. For the first time in 3 years, watching him struggle to carry an armful of old texts while holding his coffee cup. Adrian, oblivious, only noticed that Seraphina seemed slightly less pale, slightly more occupied. He ascribed it to her final papers. "Hard work, but necessary for your future, my dear," he'd commented, patting her hand distractedly as he reviewed his stock portfolio. The tension in Seraphina's life, the clash between the duty she owed and the profound, electric connection she felt, became an almost physical affliction. She started losing sleep. The air felt thin. She needed air, she needed freedom, and she needed Liam. 2 months after their first conversation, Liam asked her to drive out of the city. "There's a small hidden beach 20 miles north of the harbour. The air is different there. Come, just for a few hours." Seraphina felt the dread, the guilt, and the intense desire warring inside her. She told Adrian she was going on a weekend research trip with a group of students. The lie tasted metallic, but the promise of escape tasted of possibility. They drove north in Liam's old reliable truck. The city of Port Meridian faded into green hills and pine forests. When they reached the cove, the sun was setting, painting the water in deep hues of violet and gold. The sand was soft and cool under her feet. They talked for hours about their hopes, their failings, the books that shaped them, The vastness of the ocean, the intimacy of the setting sun, and the shared profound conversation stripped away the last layers of Seraphina's fear. Liam turned to her, and for the first time, their eyes met with the naked admission of what they both felt. He didn't touch her immediately. He simply sat closer, his presence a heavy, comforting heat. "Seraphina," he murmured, his voice low, "I know you are married. I know nothing about your obligations. But I know this. You are here because you are searching for yourself, and I am only here because I want to help you find her." She leaned into him, her head resting against the solid column of his shoulder. The scent of pine and salt and his clean, worn cotton shirt filled her senses. It was the first safe harbor her body had ever known. She lifted her face to his, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Tears of 3 years of unspoken loneliness. This was the action, the point of no return. Liam gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing the delicate curve of her cheek. His touch was nothing like Adrian's fumbling. It was a firm, knowing connection that promised tenderness and exploration, not clumsy acquisition. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to retreat. When their lips met, it was a soft, seeking pressure. Seraphina felt her entire body sigh, an internal collapse of the walls she had erected. The kiss was deep, slow, and consuming, a conversation spoken entirely in shared breath and mutual discovery. Liam pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, checking for permission, for desire. She responded not with a word but by pulling his face back to hers, a silent, desperate plea. The sand was cold, but the heat between them flared, sharp and instantaneous. They moved together, a seamless, urgent flow of discovery. The 20% eroticism wasn't in the detail of the act, but in the overwhelming, transformative feeling of it, a release from 3 years of emotional starvation. Liam was patient, his hands traveling her thin frame with reverence and awe, a gentle awakening of skin that had been asleep since birth. When his lips moved down her throat, she arched her back, a profound animalistic response to true desire. She felt the heavy wool of his coat against her bare shoulder, the cool evening air contrasting with the intense, focused warmth of his skin against hers. He discovered the truth about her in that moment, the untouched fragility, the 3 years of silence now broken by a trembling shock. He paused, his breath warm against her ear, asking silently without words, "Are you sure?" Seraphina's answer was a shuddering breath, a total, ecstatic surrender. The breach of the physical barrier was terrifying and electric. It was painful, yes, but the pain was instantly eclipsed by the stunning, overwhelming feeling of spiritual and physical liberation. It was the ultimate, defiant act against her father's order and Adrian's indifferent respect. She gave herself completely, not just her body, but the core of her identity, to the one person who saw her soul before he saw her skin. It was not merely a physical act, it was a rebirth. When it was over, they lay side by side, covered by Liam's coat, watching the stars emerge over the dark, whispering ocean. Seraphina felt an unfamiliar power pulsing through her veins, a sense of having finally claimed ownership of her own self. She was no longer a shy girl, she was a woman who had chosen her own beginning. They spent the night in a small, remote cabin Liam knew, talking in hushed tones, holding hands, and learning the geography of each other's bodies and minds, until the first rays of dawn stretched across the city, far to the south. Seraphina drove back to Port Meridian the next morning, a different person. The city no longer looked grey. The sun seemed brighter, the air tasted sharper. The ghost was gone. Adrian was waiting. He looked concerned, not because she had been gone, but because she hadn't called to check on him. "Seraphina, I was worried about the presentation of the study. Did you gather all your notes?" he asked, adjusting his tie. She stood in the middle of his pristine, airless living room, smelling faintly of the sea, pine, and Liam. "Adrian," she said, her voice steady, stronger than she had ever heard it, "I want a separation." Adrian blinked, his face perfectly composed yet utterly bewildered. "A separation? Are you unwell? Is this about the stress of the exams?" "No, this is about me. This marriage is an illusion. I am leaving. I am filing for divorce." He laughed, a short, tight sound of disbelief. "We are the perfect couple, Seraphina. Your father would never permit such a scandal. It's simply not acceptable. He fought her. Adrian, the dependable man of order, became chaotic in his refusal. He appealed to her father, who, in a terrifying, booming phone call, threatened to cut her off entirely. He played the victim to their social circle in Port Meridian, painting Seraphina as a fragile, hysterical woman driven mad by academic pressure. The battle lasted 6 agonizing months. Adrian refused to sign the papers, arguing that her sudden, illogical change of heart proved her instability. But Seraphina persisted. She found a strength she didn't know she possessed, forged in the heat of that connection with Liam. She understood now that the greatest action she could take was not physical, but legal, emotional, and social. She moved out, taking only her books and a single worn suitcase, and rented a tiny apartment in the university district, far from the harbor. She worked at a bookstore and finished her degree. Liam never pressured her. He was her foundation, her quiet strength. He simply waited, meeting her at the same cafe, listening to the legal battles and reminding her with every touch of his hand that she was worthy of love and freedom. Finally, after securing a brilliant final grade and gaining the quiet support of a few of her mother's distant relatives, Seraphina presented Adrian with the final, legally binding papers. She didn't ask, she informed him. She was no longer a ghost to be commanded. Facing the reality of a scandal that was now inevitable, Adrian finally signed. The moment the divorce was final, Seraphina walked out of the law office and found Liam waiting for her on the stone steps. The city air was crisp, the sun bright, shining on the water of the Port Meridian Bay she could now see clearly. He didn't rush her. He only smiled, a slow, warm smile that reached his kind eyes. "It's done," she said, the words a joyous relief. "I know," Liam replied, taking her hand. His grip was firm and steady, a promise of permanence that felt nothing like a cage. They didn't marry immediately. They took their time, exploring the world outside the city, finishing their degrees, and simply existing together in the easy, profound intimacy they had discovered on that distant beach. Years later, Seraphina stood on the balcony of their shared home, a small, light-filled place overlooking the vibrant docks of Port Meridian, the sea air finally welcome. She watched Liam working in the garden below, his dark hair messy, his laughter carried up on the breeze. She was no longer thin from anxiety, but lean with health and happiness, her dark eyes now shining with an inner light that could never again be dimmed. The shy girl was a distant memory. The woman who remained was the owner of her own heart, a champion of her own story, and profoundly, beautifully in love. The great, defining moment of her life wasn't the wedding that caged her, but the decisive, liberating moment she gave herself, mind, body, and spirit, to the man who taught her the meaning of true freedom. Her happy ending was not merely being loved, but finally, wholly, loving herself.